surely. Have you started the timer? Would you be able to restart it for now? Right. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Iman. I just finished my master's at the LSE, and today I'm going to be presenting some research which is actually my dissertation. So I just finished this about 2 months ago, and it's still very fresh, so I'm looking forward to presenting it for you. Just some context to get started. In recent years across the United Kingdom, there's been a lot of debate around Britishness, what it is to be British, what our national identity is, and this was spurred on a lot by things like the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, the Brexit vote in 2016, and now we've reached a sort of modus operandi where political parties across the UK are competing about who can best deliver Britishness, because what that signifies and what patriotism in the political sense in Britain signifies is a level of competence. So in politics we have issues that are contentious, so there's a lot of debate amongst voters about what should be the right decision. Patriotism is generally consensus, so all voters will agree it's good if a party is patriotic because it means that they're competent, they can get stuff done in the British interest. Patriotism in itself is a complex term to define, but for the purposes of my essay, I define it as a love of one's country, identifying with it, feeling compatriotism with your, feeling benefit for your compatriots rather than nationalism. So it's more rooted in a civic pride and a civic identity than a nationalist sort of pride. And in Britain, overall, patriotism tends to be civic and inclusive. So rather than being grounded in like ethno-nationalist discourse, it's much more if you like British values, if you feel attached to Britain, you're British. And I think what is the key sort of link between this and media, which is the second part of my analysis, is we feel that Britishness and we're exposed to that British identity through our consumption of the media. So this kind of goes back to Anderson's imagined communities and how these social identities are made. And through the media that we consume, we opt into these socialized identities at a broader level. So I'm going to delve further into the theory that sort of grounds my analysis. So I'm a political scientist by training, and what my research is doing right now is looking at media effects broadly, and also the interaction that it has with public opinion and attitudinal change in the long term. So when we talk about media effects, usually these fall into two categories. There's salience, which is how much an issue is talked about, the importance of the issue, or in this sense, when media decides that an issue is important, they set that agenda that the issue is important, and framing. So in what ways is this issue being spoken about? And in the specific sort of element of patriotism, in the British context, it's very much rooted in national identity. So how patriotic you feel about Britain is often underscored by your affiliation with Britain, so your national identity and attachment towards Britain. And these sorts of attitudes are typically much more stable because they are rooted in your identity, they're typically formed early in your life, and they stay quite, not always, but they stay generally quite constant throughout time. So existing literature tends to tell us that these sorts of attitudes are reinforced through media, but they're not necessarily changed through media effects. And these theories kind of underpin the direction that my research will be taking. So I constructed these research questions to basically structure the rest of my project. I'll touch on the hypotheses in more detail later on, but broadly speaking, these are the two things that I'm looking at for the rest of this discussion. Now, I mentioned in my presentation yesterday as well, but I go to LSE, and LSE is a very quantitative university. Even if you yourself don't enjoy it, you have to do it. So I did a mixed methods approach to approach this question. The first part was building a big novel corpus. I used Nexus. I pulled about 440 articles from the BBC, The Guardian, The Sun, The Telegraph, For those of you who aren't aware of the British context, the BBC is the public service broadcaster, so even though it's not actually in practice always unbiased, it's meant to be neutral. Guardian is a centre-left broadsheet, and the Telegraph is a centre-right broadsheet. The Sun is a tabloid, quite a right-wing tabloid. The first part of the analysis with this was a dictionary-based analysis, so this was to underpin the salience part. So I was looking at, within these articles from these outlets, how often are they talking about patriotism? So I constructed this dictionary of these keywords and just said, across these articles, how often is it being mentioned? The second part was a much deeper content analysis, and I'll show you the coding framework on the next slide. But in this, I also added the party leader conference speeches from each Labour Party and Conservative Party conference across that time period, because I think it's important to also consider what's happening at the political level, given that politics, media, public opinion, they're always sort of reinforcing each other. And this was supplemented by a longitudinal analysis of the British election study covering the time period in question to look at what public opinion, what public attitudes are saying. The main limitation here is that there was no direct measure of patriotism, so I had to proxy it by using national identity, so Britishness, Englishness, Scottishness, as there was no direct how patriotic are you question. The coding framework that I used for the articles is as follows. It's fairly self-explanatory. Every article was put through this approach. The one that I do want to clarify is inclusiveness. So what I meant here was, when patriotism is being spoken about, is there a boundary that's being drawn as to who is patriotic and who isn't? So, for example, if an article said, the SNP are not true patriots, that would be exclusive. But if someone said, you can criticize your country and be patriotic as well, that's fine, that's inclusive. And I had a second coder as well code about 30% of the sample, and there was almost perfect agreement, so that shows that it was a good framework to use. Moving on to results, obviously because it was a huge sample, I've just kind of highlighted the key takeaways for the purposes of this presentation. The main thing that we can tell from this graph is the Telegraph really likes to talk about patriotism, but in general, all of the outlets are following a similar sort of trend. These spikes that you notice are always in response to external events like an election or the coronation or the referendum, for example. So this is a fairly unsurprising finding, I think. And the second part, this is really sort of the crux of what I was trying to show. Where we have on this side salience of patriotism mentions over time. So this is how often all of the outlets are talking about patriotism. And on the right we have patriotic attitudes, how British people are feeling. As you can see, there's not much of an overlap. They don't really correspond with each other. So this is again reiterating our intuition that actually attitudes towards national identity and towards patriotism are pretty stable and are not that influenced by what's going on in the media landscape, which is reinforcing the theory that we know already. So this is sort of the crux of the paper, but I'm going to go into it in a bit more detail later on. Just another way of showing by outlet the salience of patriotism, and I then sort of split this into Britishness overall, Scottishness, Englishness, and again, where it does peak, these correspond with elections or the referendum, which again shows that any mobilization in attitudes is in response to an external political event, less so media driving it in itself. So moving on to the content analysis. Now this is of all of the articles and the speeches that I looked at. What was perhaps most unsurprising is that when political elites, so this is the party leader speeches, when they talk about patriotism, almost overwhelmingly it's positive. And this goes back to what we discussed earlier, where because patriotism is sort of signaling this competence to voters, it's unsurprising that politicians will continue to talk about it positively. And I think it's quite interesting how, this was David Cameron, former British Prime Minister. In 2014 he makes a statement, and the sentiment of that statement is pretty much directly echoed by Keir Starmer 10 years later. So politicians are always sort of talking about it in a very positive way. At an overall level, the exclusive framing that I was talking about earlier usually comes out when we talk about Brexit or the economy. So either your opinion on the referendum is wrong and you're not patriotic, or your opinion on tax policy is wrong and you're not patriotic. This sort of discourse was really where that exclusive framing came out. inclusive framing, and this is across all outlets. Inclusive framing, again, was associated with positive sentiment, and this was often found when we talk about British democracy, British institutions, the NHS, for example. What I thought was most interesting was that it also comes out when we talk about the Scottish independence referendum and migration, which are both quite contentious issues, so I was surprised that these were always framed in a positive and inclusive way as well. And I found this one particularly interesting. So the Telegraph is a conservative newspaper, but you can see here they're talking about the success of sort of assimilationist, good British integration. So I thought that was quite surprising for me personally. I was not expecting that from them. Moving on to how the outlets approached sentiment. Again, not surprising that the right-wing outlets are talking about patriotism positively, and The Guardian and the BBC are more neutral, fairly standard for what we'd expect. Inclusiveness was another one that I found unsurprising. Again, right-wing outlets are more exclusive in their framing of patriotism. The Guardian is much more inclusive. There is some interesting context to why this might be. So The Guardian was actually the first British newspaper to openly criticize the conception of patriotism, because they were openly against the government's expansionism during the Boer War and said that we can't be truly patriotic if we agree with this expansionism. So it's interesting that they've continued on with that sort of historical trajectory over time. Now onto the statistical analysis. So this was, again, as I mentioned, LSE, very quant. I did a few regressions, basically. Here I was trying to unpick that if you have these attitudes, your national identity, your patriotic attitudes, what other factors are influencing how you feel in terms of your national identity? So I did one regression model that was looking at just demographic variables, and then I did another one which added your level of political engagement, your media consumption habits, crucially to see, does the media that you consume affect how strongly nationalistic or how strongly patriotic you feel? And I only highlighted this model because this was the only one that actually had an impact. So what it showed is that people's national identity and attitudes in this sense were deeply rooted in their religiosity, their ethnicity, their household income, but really their media consumption and political engagement didn't really have an impact. So again, this goes back to what we discussed earlier, which is your sort of early socialization, early exposure. That's what drives how you feel. These are stable attitudes over time that are set quite early in life, don't tend to change as much over time. And the only instance where media consumption actually made a significant impact was when it comes to how you perceive of a party's patriotism. So whether or not you think the Labour Party is more or less conservative, more or less patriotic than the Conservatives, that was elicited by media consumption. What I will add is, I mentioned earlier there was no specific one patriotism question in the BES study, so I had to use a proxy variable. In some waves of the study, they might ask a question that's a bit more patriotic explicitly. So they might ask, how proud do you feel of Britain? How ashamed do you feel of Britain? Do you like the monarchy? Much more sort of explicitly patriotic questions. These were one-off, so maybe it was in a wave that corresponded with a coronation, they would ask a question about the monarchy. And I think, again, what this reiterates is that it's events that drive changes in our attitudes, in our identity, not the media. The media is just sort of reflecting it and doing its own thing. So that's kind of the basis of my research and my findings, and I want to spend the next few minutes talking about the implications of this and what we can learn from it. So, in terms of conclusions, what I set out to show, I think I've more or less shown, is that the salience of patriotism in the media, it spikes around external events. So it's really these exogenous events that are driving how often we talk about patriotism in the media. The framing varies by outlet, but it's consistent with the ideological leanings more or less. Crucially, the correspondence of patriotic attitudes with the media is limited. So this is again showing that our attitudes are sort of underpinned by what we experienced before. Whatever happens in the media does not necessarily shift them. It's more what's happening on in the outside world and what we experienced when we were younger. What I really wanted to unpick is in the next slide. So the implications, I think, of this study are quite profound. As someone I've always been very interested in the effects of media on how we view the world. And I found that what's particularly interesting to me is this point here, where the non-alignment between the public discourse and the media is really obvious when we look at how there are so many policies that have huge amounts of public support, but they gain no media coverage. So nationalization of key services is a big part of this, and I'll touch on this in my next slide as well. But a lot of this is to do with the fact that the media institution, particularly in the UK, is very much a corporate institution in its own right. It has its own incentives, it has its own affairs. So to treat it as an accurate thermometer of what the public is thinking is not the best way of going about it. And I really want to stress this final point on this slide, which is that though the media might not necessarily change our attitudes in the short run, it is probably quite instrumental in building those attitudes in the first place. So I want you to think about when you were younger. What sort of TV was playing in the house? What newspapers were your parents reading? This exposure is really formative, the one that happens in our early years, and whether we realize it or not, it does affect how we view the world and how we view our identity. And if you go to any school in Britain, and this is touching a lot on banal nationalism, most schools in Britain will have a poster that says, what are British values? These are British values. You're exposed to that from a very young age. You'll see poppies on Remembrance Day being sold at every tube station. So whether or not we realize it, these are very formative experiences. The broadcasting of the 1 minute silence on Armistice Day. This is all how the media is, from a very young age, building our conception of national identity. And I spoke to an academic actually while I was doing some research for this, and she mentioned a really interesting example, which was that in Yorkshire, which is an area of England that has a really distinct regional identity, they prefer to read local news over national news because the local news actually continues to reaffirm their regional identity, whereas the BBC, for example, might be diminishing it comparatively. So, the final point that I'd like to stress again is that, as I mentioned, the media is not something that I think we can always conceive of as an accurate thermometer of public opinion. It has its own interests, it has its own incentives, and increasingly so in the UK context, it tends to echo elite political interests and the elite political lobby much more than the public discourse. So there was a lot of literature that came out about how for Keir Starmer, when he first came into power, it was really important for him to win the media and show to the British media that he could be patriotic, he could be competent. So he was often changing his tune to match what the preferences of the media were. And I want to close by focusing on this final point that I thought was quite interesting. So Habermas talks about how political legitimacy is derived from public discourse. But if, as we've seen, the media is not really reflective of genuine public discourse, then is the media really legitimate at all? So in terms of sort of going ahead with this research, I would like to publish it in some form, I don't know in what form, either just the sort of content analysis part or the whole paper, whether to do it in a political science journal or a communications journal, also I'm not so sure yet, so I'd really appreciate any feedback to that end. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Iman. The next speaker will be Athena